Hong Kong and Singapore are two of the leading financial hubs of Asia. I'm currently here in Hong Kong and I've been to both of these cities multiple times, so I thought it would be interesting to compare which one of these cities would be better for living as an expat. Which one gives you better taxes, better cost of living, better lifestyle, things like that. So generally, Asia is a fantastic place to live. I love Asia. I think it's the future, and obviously there's many places in Asia where you could live. A lot of people love Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, but if you are a business owner, you're doing business at any kind of serious level, you probably want to have a tax and a financial base somewhere where you have your banking, where you have your tax residence, where you have your company. So if you like Asia like I do, these two cities are going to be something that you are going to think about, because they are sort of the financial hubs, the developed places in Asia where you might want to have your hub. But there's big differences between these two cities, and they're gonna cater to slightly different kind of people. I know these cities have kind of a rivalry as like the top city in Asia, so I thought it'd be interesting to give my perspective on where I personally would rather want to live if I had to choose. By the way, if you want to set up companies or relocate to either of these places and you're looking for someone to help you do that, I'm going to leave a link to Awesome, who is my contact. They essentially have services for both of these countries for company setup. In the case of Singapore, they will also help you relocate to Singapore. We'll talk about more in detail about how that works later on in the video. So whichever place you're interested in, just check out those links down below in the description. And just to note for this video, I am a self-employed online business owner. I run some YouTube channel, I have a software business, things like that. And essentially the way I do my business is that it is not connected to the locations where I actually live, and I earn my money online, completely detached from the local economy. So just to note that this video doesn't include things like job market or salaries or work culture or things like that, because I have no experience with any of that. This is strictly about living in these places, assuming that you can earn essentially the same income in both of them. So first we need to go about just a general vibe of the place. This is going to be a big determinant of which one you like, because they have very sort of different vibes, even though they are also similar in a lot of ways. So Hong Kong is going to be a very gritty place. It's more like, it's kind of like a New York City kind of vibe, where there's super cramped, ton of people, ton of skyscrapers, people are always in a rush. I find it to be a really fast-paced city, pretty much the most fast-paced city I have ever been to almost. Singapore is also a fast-paced city, but I find Hong Kong is just on a different level when it comes to that. Like everything in Hong Kong is optimized to just be as efficient as possible and to get things done as fast as possible for all the very busy people that inhabit it. Hong Kong is older, it's gonna be like less perfect, where Singapore is just very like perfect. Like that's what I can describe it. Like things are super clean, things work extremely well. Not that they don't work extremely well in Hong Kong. So if you like the more like older, more gritty, like authentic vibe, then Hong Kong is probably gonna have more of that. You're gonna have more like street markets and like small local street food and like just interesting things to look at in Hong Kong. Whereas in Singapore, it's probably gonna be more practical, and generally it's gonna be a more pleasant environment, at least in my experience. In terms of language, Singapore is mainly English based. You have obviously a lot of different ethnicities who speak a lot of languages, but English is the main language. In Hong Kong, English ability is like okay, but the main language there is definitely Cantonese and Mandarin. And I found it quite surprising how poorly English was spoken there, considering that it used to be a British colony and things like that. So that is gonna give an advantage to Singapore for many people, just because it's easier to communicate with people. Although for me personally, I kind of like the fact that Hong Kong has lower English levels, because if I lived there, like as someone who loves to learn languages, it would motivate me to learn the language, and like Cantonese, Mandarin would be something that I would love to learn, whereas if I lived in Singapore, I probably wouldn't learn any other language. In terms of weather, Singapore is pretty much right on the equator, which is going to give you a very tropical, very hot climate year round. Any time of the year, if you go outside during the middle of the day, you are going to be sweating. In Hong Kong, the summers are very hot and humid, but the winters are going to be more temperate, even a bit cold. I was there in March and it was even like pretty cold. I had to wear a jacket outside. So again, it's just gonna be which kind of weather do you personally prefer. In terms of housing, now I think in Singapore it is more expensive to rent an apartment, but in Hong Kong it's going to be much more expensive to buy an apartment. And I would imagine that in Singapore, despite it being more expensive, like for the average 1-bedroom apartment, the average 1-bedroom apartment is also probably going to be a bit more spacious. It's going to be a bit more modern. Hong Kong famously has these super old houses that are like the most expensive in the world, but they're extremely cramped. People live in very, very tiny spaces because the real estate is so insanely expensive, and it's obviously a much older place than Singapore is. So in terms of housing, I would probably prefer to have the average home in Singapore rather than in Hong Kong, but that's just kind of my preference. I like more like modern vibes and things like that. And in Singapore also, if you are a resident, they have the HDB, so the government provided housing, which is actually, from what I understand, very, very good, and you can get some pretty good value there from what I understand. But they're also going to have the private, like more luxurious modern condos, also going to be more expensive. In terms of transport, they're going to be quite similar in the sense that they're very like compact small cities that both have very good public transport. They have metros, buses that work extremely well, and you can get around anywhere just using the public transport with no issues. If you want to drive, however, that's going to be a much more tricky in Singapore just because it's going to be a lot more expensive. So essentially Singapore has this policy where they want to manage traffic by just making car ownership extremely expensive. I think any car you buy, you have to pay like 100% tax just to be able to get the license to own a car. So if you really want to be able to drive and own a car, there's going to be a big consideration for you. Air quality wise, which is a really important metric that I look at more and more these days, Singapore is gonna win hands down. It has like pretty pristine air quality. Like it's interesting, like it's this place in the middle of Southeast Asia where everywhere else around it air quality can be pretty bad, but in Singapore they really managed it well. The air quality is generally like in the green, so very good. In Hong Kong it's not terrible, but it's usually like on the yellow, so like moderate. So if you're sensitive to it, then this might be something to look at. If you're not sensitive to it, then I don't think it's a super big deal, but just something to take into account. In terms of taxes and cost of living, so generally Singapore is going to be more expensive in terms of the cost of living and also in terms of the taxes. Now, I made a video previously on how you can optimize taxes in Singapore and things like that, and potentially depending on what you make, you could be paying even single-digit taxes. However, the tax rates on the personal income do go up to 24%, whereas in Hong Kong, they only go up to 17%. However, like I mentioned in that tax optimization Singapore video, is that if you are self-employed, so you own your own company, then what you can essentially do is optimize the income in such a way that the maximum rate that you would ever pay is 17%, because the corporate tax rate is 17%. And even then there's like small business exemptions and like startup schemes and things like that. But because they don't have any dividend taxes, what you can essentially do is structure your income in such a way that you pay yourself salary only up until the point where the personal income rates would go above your corporate rate, and above that you simply pay dividends. So you really should never pay more than 17% in Singapore. And if you make less than, let's say, $500,000 a year, then you're really going to be paying much less than that because of these schemes and optimization ways and things like that. In Hong Kong, on the corporate side, the way it works is that the rate is 16.5%, but for the first 2 million Hong Kong dollars, so what is that, like 250, 300,000 US dollars, you're going to pay only half of that, so 8.25%. Whereas on the personal side, it's going to go from 2% up until 17%. So you're going to have probably slightly more optimal taxes in Hong Kong, although they are quite similar. Just looking at cost of living, we can see that when you don't include rent, cost of living in Hong Kong is around 9.2% lower than Singapore, which from my experience is pretty accurate. And when you include rent, it's going to be 13.8% cheaper in Hong Kong compared to Singapore. Now, in terms of relocation and visa, so Singapore, in my opinion, is going to be a bit more easy to move to. Like the process is a bit more straightforward and a bit more objective. So essentially the way it works, you set up a company and then you issue yourself an employment pass via that company. Now it's not as simple as just doing that. There is a point system. They're like compass point system that you need to pass. And I made a more detailed video on this, but essentially as long as you like pay yourself, let's say more than between $5,000 to $10,000 a month, if you make enough to pay yourself that much, then you should be able to get enough points. And if you have like a university degree or something like that, then you should be able to pass this point system. And really, if you make below that, then you probably shouldn't be looking to move to Singapore anyway. Probably there's better options out there. In terms of Hong Kong, they have a similar like quality migrant scheme or something like that, where they have these points criteria and things like that. Now there, I don't know exactly how difficult it is to go through that because I haven't looked into it in that much detail, but I know people who have relocated to Hong Kong and things like that. So it is going to be possible, but I think it's a bit more complicated to go through that than the Singapore option. But here, Hong Kong is going to have the advantage that it's going to be easier to get permanent residency in Hong Kong. I believe after you live there for 7 years, you just get permanent residency and it's available to everyone. Whereas in Singapore, where they do have permanent residency and even citizenship down the line, from what I understand, these days it is very difficult to qualify and there are no objective criteria for this. Like they look at things like your ethnicity and like what do you do and things like that. And it's going to be an entirely subjective and a very opaque process where you can apply for it anytime you want. You can even apply for it after like 2 years, but it's actually very difficult to get them to approve you. And there's people who have lived there for like 20 years and kept applying and they still haven't been approved, but they haven't even been told why they haven't been approved. So if you're looking for a permanent place to live and you like that permanent residency, then in Hong Kong, that is probably going to be easier to get. So as a conclusion, I think Hong Kong is a more interesting city to visit. There's a lot more things to see there. It's like a lot of hustle and bustle and like a lot of things happening around you. However, I think Singapore would be more livable, at least in the long run, for someone like me, at least for my preferences. But obviously people are going to disagree. I know there's a lot of like competition between these two cities and things like that. So it's really going to depend on what kind of vibe you prefer. If you prefer a super fast-paced environment that's more like older, then you're probably going to prefer Hong Kong. If you want a bit more of a relaxed lifestyle, even though like Singapore is not a relaxed place, it's still a very fast-paced city, but in comparison between these two places, and you want things to be a bit more polished and you like perhaps warmer weather, then Singapore is going to be more of your vibe. However, for now, I'm not really considering going to either of these places. I'm perfectly happy keeping my financial ties and my tax residence in Dubai, where I currently live, where I've been living for the past 2 years and what I mainly make content about on this channel. So I actually compared both Singapore and Hong Kong to Dubai. On this channel, I made videos on both of them, and you can watch Hong Kong versus Dubai here and Singapore versus Dubai here. So watch one of these videos next, and I will see you in the next one.